Hello everyone, my name is Adrian Markish and I am the publisher and editor of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I would like to welcome you to today's webinar titled 5 Steps to Better Quality Requirements. Today's featured speaker is Ian Alexander, principal with Scenario Plus. Ian will be presenting alongside Fergal McGovern, founder of VisibleThread. But before we get started, I would like to quickly go over a few administrative items. First of all, I want to point out that all audio lines have been muted for the attendees except for the presenters. However, you can submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. Any questions that we won't be able to address during the session will surely be answered via email after the event. The session will last approximately 60 minutes, but could run a little longer depending on the number of questions that we get. Also, would like to point out that a survey will be provided to you upon leaving the session, and we would surely greatly appreciate your feedback. The webinar and the slides will also be archived at ModernAnalyst.com as well as at VisibleThread.com following the event. Our featured speaker today, our guest for the day, is Ian Alexander, and he is an internationally renowned requirements engineering expert. Ian is best known for authoring numerous books, including Writing Better Requirements and most recently Discovering Requirements. His experience spans numerous industries and fields, including transportation, telecom, aerospace, government, and other public sector services. Ian is also the chairman of the British Computing Society's Requirements Engineering Specialty Group. So welcome, Ian, to today's session. Alongside Ian is Fergal McGovern, who is the founder and CEO of VisibleThread. Having previously founded the requirements management vendor SteelTrace, Mr. McGovern has extensive experience in the applicability of requirements-driven development and quality-oriented IT processes. And his most current interests are in the area of defect detection in BRDs and associated documents at program and project level. So welcome, Fergal, as well. Quickly on the agenda. First, Ian is going to cover some 5 steps to better quality on the requirement side, as we promised, and then Fergal is going to show you how to automate documentation and how to automate document quality inspections via VisibleThread. At this point, I would like to pass it on to Ian to get us started.
Thank you very much, Adrian, and hello everybody. I'm going to speak a little bit about some simple steps to improve requirement quality by doing some various ways of validating your requirements. There are a lot of ways of doing quality, and people have very different meanings by it. But what I'm talking about today is simply ways of checking requirements that are very simple and can be partly automated with tools or can be done with nothing more complicated than pencil or paper. You'll see the kind of thing we mean. What I'd like to do before we get too stuck in is to get Adrian to do some of his technical wizardry behind the scenes and to organize a little poll in which you can all vote. So what I'd like you to do is answer just the one following question. Do you validate your requirements? Answer 1, only informally. Do you validate your requirements only by holding some kind of formal review or Fagan inspection, or work through some kind of formally structured review process in which you look through the requirements? Or answer 3, do you validate your requirements by combining several different methods, possibly none mentioned here? So make your minds up, and Adrian will add up the results for us in a moment.
Wait for a few more seconds. It looks like folks are voting. The percentages are going up. Okay, we'll close the poll in 1 second. Very well, about 85% of you have voted. I will close the poll, and here are the results. 18% of you have said only informally. 29% of you have said only by formal review and walkthroughs. And 54% of you have said by combining both methods.
Thank you very much, Adrian. So I'm very interested to see that we have a mix of different approaches among the audience. I'm sure many of you are very highly experienced, and it's very interesting that there are different results. I'd love to know which industries you all work in, but I'm sure there's some sort of correlation between the way you do things and where you're working. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started on my slides. So what I want to talk about today is how we go about validating requirements. And I want you to think about this in terms of a cycle. Cycles are very popular today. People think about life cycles or agile rushes or whatever. And no matter, as those examples indicate, no matter what kind of industry you're in and what kind of approach you're probably using, cycles are inherent. And one kind of cycle is the discover, document, validate cycle. And I think you'll find this is pretty much what we do in everyday life. We read about something, we think about something, we talk about something with our friends, we work out how we're going to do things, we make a note on the palm of our hand or the sleeve of our scruffy coat or whatever it is, and then we get the job done. We have a look to see what we've done, if it's a prototype or we're mending some machine in the house. We then check what we've done, see if it's all right. If it is, we go on and use it. If not, we go around again. Now, with development, we're discovering requirements from a range of different stakeholders. Some of those people may eventually be the users of whatever we're doing. Some people may be financial beneficiaries. Some people may get the benefit that the user's work is creating. There may be industry regulators. Everybody, I think, now has heard about regulators in the financial industry and whether they did their job or not. So there's a range of different stakeholders, and we may be involved in talking to any of them, reading documents produced by any of them. We discover requirements. We then try and catalog our requirements as best we can, and then we have the task of saying, have we got the best? Are we ready to go ahead and develop? Or perhaps if we're developing in an agile way, maybe we validate a small chunk of requirements, we develop those, and then we go around validation. So it actually doesn't matter which way we're doing this. In any case, we will be going round this cycle. So we're going to look at validating the requirements. And what we're going to do then is take a look at the kind of life cycle that I was talking about, the a V model, and this has the idea that what we're doing is specifying and designing on the left-hand limb of the V, and then we're testing and integrating on the right-hand limb of the V. And the question is, how do we make sure we have the right requirements feeding into such a process? Well, there may be several questions that we can ask. I've already mentioned stakeholders. And our first question, I think, is, are we writing down, have we written down what the stakeholders actually need? We may have a good, clean set of requirements. They may be comfortable from the point of view of analysis and modeling, but are they, in fact, the real requirements? There's no formal way of doing that. The only thing we can do is find various ways of playing through the requirements, animating them, simulating them, doing a little bit of a theatre workshop, showing people what the implications are. It's no good expecting all the stakeholders to read hundreds of pages of specification and technical models. Secondly, we can do our own analytic work on models, on lists of requirements, and we can ask ourselves, are these internally consistent? Are they well structured? And thirdly, We can consult with other people on the project team who may be testers, expert in seeing whether requirements are verifiable. We can consider with management, are these requirements realistic given the resources available? We can prioritize by debating with designers how much effort will be needed for the different requirements, how much benefit people will get, and so on. So there may be a whole range of different activities, and I think you can see already from the questions we have on this slide that the activities are in fact extremely dissimilar. And the good news is that we can ask several different types of question, each of which helps us to be more assured that our requirements are indeed valid. So let's take a very simple tutorial example. Let's suppose that what we're doing is creating an embedded software device which we hope will be useful and profitable for every outdoor leisure activity. So the profitable says one bunch of stakeholders is the company, its board, its shareholders, and so on. But I haven't shown them here. I've shown all kinds of what we could call users, I guess. There could be cyclists, no cyclist on the bike, I noticed. And they might be interested in how fast they're going, how far they've gone, which way they're going on a compass heading. Maybe they need a little map display. Maybe they need a lamp for when it's getting dark. The skier, well, if they get covered up by an avalanche, as has been happening in the last few days in some parts of the world, then maybe a rescue beacon would be life-saving. Maybe they're very interested in having the temperature on a little device on their belt. The canoeist, how far am I down this river? What time is it now? Maybe the alpinist is interested in the barometer, what's the weather doing, a map, a flash lamp if he needs to call for help. So there might be a whole range of functions. Some of these have a hardware feel to them, but there are many software aspects to them, and of course we need a convenient user interface, and we need the device to be robust and simple to use, because many people will be wearing gloves, the device had better be waterproof, and so on. So we have a device which has a range of very different kinds of requirement, and I think you can see some very challenging things to meet. And how this might work is presumably this device will be able to pick up data. A critical piece of information is navigation from the GPS satellites, and we will also very probably want to pick up mobile data. Perhaps we can get weather reports in that way. Maybe there are other bits of information too that might be of interest. So what might the requirements look like? Maybe you've written down, these are intentionally rough, maybe you've written down there must be a rescue beacon for skiing, etc. And the MFD, let's use an acronym, that's the multifunction device that we're making, should be able to issue weather warnings. Maybe we'd like a barometer, we'd like an emergency lamp. We're a bit concerned that it's rather large and heavy. We want to be able to have recharging in the field if we're out for days or perhaps even weeks at a time. And we're starting to think about the various qualities that this device must have: shockproofness, waterproofness, light to carry, small and convenient, simple to use with gloves on, all of these kinds of quality and constraint on how the device could possibly be built so that it will be acceptable. The functions alone are not sufficient. Okay, so we've written down something. How do we know if those are all right? I think I've already said that there may be many different ways that we can go about doing validation. And it seems to me that there are some very, very simple checks that we can do. I've chosen just 5 today because we can't go on all day. And these are just small, simple things that you can probably do with any set of requirements. I'm sure you'll find plenty more while I'm talking. You'll think of a few more. And I'll say a few words at the end of the talk about where you can find more information on other kinds of check. So let's just focus on these as examples. Firstly, looking at the grammar and syntax of the written requirements. Secondly, looking for missing measurements. Are these requirements going to be verifiable? Thirdly, looking for stray terms which seem only to have been used once. Fourthly, looking for possible conflicts, either within single requirements or between requirements. And fifthly, the old but still very useful CRUD check. So what about the grammar? How can we tell from just inspecting requirements individually that there's anything wrong with them? Well, I've highlighted a few words in some of these requirements in red. Let's say a few words about those. we're providing a display. What do you mean providing? What's going on there? Does that build a picture in our mind? We're just putting something in, we're including something. It's not very good. We'd rather write the requirements in a simple and direct way. I'm out skiing, so I want there to be a rescue beacon. Well, we're still talking about a thing. We'd ideally talk about transmit an avalanche beacon signal. We want to be rescued. What about the unless? How comfortable is that? Well, we've just said we should have an emergency light, then we've put a comma on here, and then, oops, we're backing off. We've got a get out clause, take me out of jail. So we'll do this unless it seems a bit difficult. Well, the problem with this is that any supplier or programmer or developer will go, oh, well, let's save some money on this project. Let's not do this one. So unless is very dangerous because the customer thinks he's getting something, the supplier thinks he's not getting something, and of course they may end up in the courtroom. So that's pretty undesirable. The etc. actually has rather a similar result. It's a beacon for skiing. Well, maybe the beacon would be useful for, I don't know, climbing or mountain walking or this and that. So is it really necessary if we're just going skiing with this device? Well, perhaps it isn't. So it introduces confusion and ambiguity, and that does much the same as the unless. What about the should and the would, all these words? They're all slightly weasel words, we say. They're all tending to imply that we don't have to do things. The tradition is all the requirements that are mandatory are written with a shall. I wouldn't like to say you have to do that. It was a good tradition because it was easy with old-fashioned text processing to count the shalls. But it was just one way you could go about making things easy to check. What about our missing measurements? This is a completely different check, completely independent of the other one. So maybe we found a few mistakes the first way. Here is a way of finding perhaps a few more problems. We're going to display something, all right? To what accuracy must it be displayed? We're asking for waterproofing, all right? How much waterproofing? For example, what depth of water should we resist before the thing starts to leak? Must be light to carry. How light? The question's always the same in a way. Easy to use. What does that mean? How do we measure that? Are you going to demand a full usability lab with hidden cameras and watching eye movements and so on? What are we expecting here? How much training is required? Is any training required? Should it be operable in the dark? Should it be operated with mounted gloves on? That might be a very practical requirement in this case. Small and convenient. Well, the and. There's a flashing light. What does and mean? Well, it probably means two requirements. What does small mean? Who's to say whether something's small? One person's small is somebody else's rather inconveniently large. Thirdly, another independent bite at the cherry. How else can we look for possible problems? One way is to look for terms that are used exactly once in a document. Anything that's used exactly once could well be a problem. It might be that we've made a typing error. It might be that we've got synonyms, that we've got multiple words for the same thing. Or maybe we've got things which ought to have been mentioned somewhere else in our documentation set. Perhaps the simplest thing we can do is to say, if we've got something written down in a requirement, it must have come from somewhere. Should we have some goals or objectives? Should we have a project vision or mission? There are different words for this, but should we have done some thinking? Should we have had a workshop, a brainstorming session in which we've identified what we're really trying to achieve? In that case, we've probably got some hints. We should be convenient for climbers and people in mountains. They'd like weather. It might be life critical to them. Therefore, we need very reliable weather reports. Maybe we can provide a barometer in the device. They can be very tiny nowadays, so that should we lose all radio contact in the snowstorm or something, there will still be a backup instrument, just as aircraft today still have a barometer, even though they've got all kinds of radar altimeters and so on to do the job much better under normal conditions. What about stories or scenarios or use cases or user stories? Should there be some kind of story that's talking about this? I'll give a story about the barometer in a few moments. And should we be defining some of these terms in the project dictionary? What is a rescue beacon for skiing? Can we explain that? A fourth independent check, I think you can see there's something very satisfying about having simple things we can do, very simple questions we can ask. None of these techniques are really rocket science, but we can ask very simple questions and we can ask them from different directions, and we have more and more chances to find problems with our requirements. If they come through all of this, they won't be perfect. I don't write perfect requirements, but we will come to requirements which are good enough, which will do the job, which will get the suppliers building what you want. An emergency light should be built in. Well, that's a bit of a wobbly word, unless it's too large and heavy. Well, there seems to be a bit of a conflict there. Do we want to have this thing or do we not? It's up to us to make our minds up. So unless is a bit of a trigger word, really. We shouldn't be backing out of things. As it may be difficult, what are we talking about there? Are we sure? Are we reasoning? What's happening in there? The device must be able to recharge the batteries. Well, okay, so we're going to have a charger. I have a torch with a wind-up handle. They're getting very cheap now. And it doesn't weigh that much, but it adds some mass. It adds some size to the device. And I want a barometer, and I want a lamp. So how are we going to fit in the software as well? You know, we're going to have to consider possible conflicts. Maybe the cost of doing all these different things, maybe developing and testing them, maybe the cost in terms of the electrical power available from tiny batteries, maybe the cost in terms of the mass and volume of this device, which is going to have to be pocketable or carried while people are carrying ski equipment and canoe equipment and bicycling uphill and so on. They're going to want a small device. So mass is a very critical parameter for this kind of product. So any portable device, anything right up to a spacecraft, we're going to have to keep the mass, the size, and the power down. Well, we might then get trade-offs between the requirements. There may be different functions which we want very much. Well, we may have to decide which ones we want most. And fifthly, I mentioned the old-fashioned CRUD check, the granddaddy of them all. And CRUD, in case you don't know, is simply C for create, R for retrieve or read, if you're data-oriented, U for update, and D for delete or destroy. And any data element can obviously be created, retrieved, updated, or deleted. And let's just give a couple of quick examples. We can provide a barometric pressure display. Well, if we're displaying it, clearly we have to retrieve the data. So where was it created and when is it deleted? If we've got to be able to issue a weather warning, that's a good term to go in the dictionary, whatever a weather warning may be. Again, we need to retrieve data to issue those warnings. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves, how are we creating those warnings? Are we just doing that from the barometer, or are we picking up other kinds of information? Do we have a thermometer on board? Are there other instruments, or are we relying on mobile data? Well, finally, we're coming to some requirements. Here are some which are a little better written. I'm sure we can still go on improving them, but they're starting to become usable requirements now. And we can divide those up into functions, qualities, and constraints. And we can classify the qualities and constraints in various ways. We can have conformance to standards. We can have the physical ones. We can have usability. We can have safety. We can have security, reliability, and so on and so on. So we're starting to come down to something which is beginning to look a bit more verifiable, a bit more usable on the project. So I hope that's given you a bit of an idea, and I hope it's given Fergal a bit of a challenge and an opportunity to show off what he can do with VisibleThread. You might like to look a little further in my book, Discovering Requirements, which came out last year with John Wiley. And if you want to buy a book, you'll find a whole lot of free information on my website at scenarioplus.org.uk, which includes templates and various things you can fill in, a lot of book reviews, a whole lot of information, which I hope will help you produce excellent quality requirements. And now it'll be my pleasure to hand over to Fergal, who's going to show you how you can do some of this with his tool.
Thanks very much, Ian. That was certainly very interesting, and I found it very useful to refresh on the types of simple checks that we can all do in real life, so really appreciate that. I wanted to step back a bit for a sec and look at the bigger picture in one sense from a perspective of what is the impact of poor or defective requirements. So I thought it was useful just to kind of refresh our minds. Why are we looking at this area? Why is early intervention interesting? Why is it useful? Why indeed do over 50% of people on the survey actually use some other techniques to validate requirements? Certainly 30% or thereabouts of the audience online right now are doing formal inspections, which is great. But really, what we're at is trying to bring down this defect rate and our experience with regard to actually applying the techniques that Ian just talked about, as well as avoiding this cost, is actually something I'd like to share with you. The other kind of scary stat, and again, it's useful to reflect, and I have to admit I've stolen these from Ellen Gottesdiener, who's been also greatly influential in terms of providing leadership and guidance in our industry, is the idea that if you catch a defect early, in this example, $80 is spent on catching that defect, you avoid a possible impact of $16,000. Massively incremental in terms of the issues that as you go to market, as you deploy a system where there's defects that are left unchecked, that kind of cost is simply just a bridge too far in most cases. So let me just kind of talk about the possibility of automatically checking for these things. I think everybody who's on this webinar, certainly my own experience reflects this, that it is a very tedious and laborious process to conduct inspections, to conduct review cycles. When you're reaching phase 3 of a life cycle, assuming you're somewhat waterfall-esque, or indeed if you're not more agile, it may be checking individual strands of requirements or specifications. Checking for these things is not a happy place to be. It's not something that we get a big buzz out of, but the cost impact is pretty dramatic. So what we're trying to do with VisibleThread is somehow provide an automated way for helping us get a much more efficient process in place. We find that most of the tooling, and in fact most of the work that I've done in past lives with, for instance, SteelTrace, my former product, really focuses more on the requirements management aspect. It's less focused on the qualitative analysis. And this is what VisibleThread is doing. We're saying, let's look at documents, because the vast majority of these things still live in documents, and there's various reasons for that. One is that you need some kind of audit trail. The other is that you're getting more and more stakeholders from the business having a direct connection to the IT side, and they speak and hear and use Word and Excel as a matter of course. There isn't even an option in many cases to actually switch their behavior over to requirements management solutions. So we're left with a large body of work, and really the question is, can we provide intelligence inside those documents? Not just manage the documents themselves, not just manage a BRD or an architecture doc or a test plan or a vision statement. Get inside the document. Let's see, can we actually support what Ian is talking about in terms of his 5 techniques, and indeed more than 5. Today I'm going to focus on ambiguous language, credibility, but there are many other metrics that we can start to provide from an automated fashion, thereby lowering the overall pain, to be frank, of actually reviewing inspection cycles. The benefits of all of this stuff is that if you can do this in an effective way, and I'd like to suggest that we can with VisibleThread, you start to get real-time visibility. You start to get objective metrics, metrics that are far more effective in terms of subtle behavior changes. To Ian's point, a requirement specification or requirements document, it evolves, it changes shape. Ian showed you a simple example of fairly basic draft requirements morphing into something much more comprehensive and much more interesting, and also much more actionable and measurable. But they still have a ways to go. We still need to consider how that display gets its metrics, or gets its data, and lots of kind of scenario planning, and that will evolve more and more. So what we're trying to do is give this visibility and objectivity inside the document content. If you're swimming around in multiple documents, many of them can be well over 20, 50, 100 pages in length, it's simply very difficult to actually counteract that document fatigue that happens in many organizations. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, look, carry on with Microsoft Word, carry on with that approach, and let's try and wrapper that with some kind of thing that will give you some insight into the techniques that Ian was talking about. Ultimately, what we're looking at is also a simple and easy deployment on this stuff because, again, one of the biggest challenges that vendors have in this industry, and indeed it's not just this industry, is shelfware. And what we're trying to avoid is the notion of shelfware. So usability is key in terms of what VisibleThread, or indeed any vendor who's trying to offer value in this space, can deliver. So I'm going to focus today on ambiguous language, and I'm going to focus on document term frequency because these will support the 5 basic checks that Ian was talking about. And that's not to say that that's the only stuff we do, but certainly for the purposes of today's session, it will be useful to consider those. To give you a sense for what I'm going to cover out, there's 2 core components in the VisibleThread deployment. One on the left-hand side is a plugin or add-in into Microsoft Word into the authoring environment as it stands today. The second component of that is an oversight or review component, and I'll be looking at that to actually start to flag some of these issues that Ian has discussed. We also store these documents so we can track change and so forth, and that's almost a secondary benefit for having a controlled environment such as this. So I'm going to take my life into my own hands, and I'm going to try an online demo. Let's wish me luck. So at this point, I'll switch gears here a little bit. I'm going to show you my desktop. I'm going to show you, actually, oddly enough, the MFD, the multifunction device, requirements before the inspection process happened, and I'm going to show you the same version after the inspection process happened. And I'm showing you right now a dashboard. And effectively, this document was something that we created before. I'll just give you a quick glimpse as to what's in the document. It's the collection of functions and quality constraints that actually Ian showed in his PowerPoint presentation. Very quickly in passing, you'll notice that there's a plugin over here on the right. I'll defer talking about that for the moment, but I'll instead focus on what happens when we upload that document to our server. So we've uploaded it. It's in an area called Webinar in Alexander, February 2010. This is just an arbitrary collection of documents. And now that I look on the right-hand side, we've got a tab called Quality Compliance. So if I start to look at that quality compliance, I start to look at the first thing that Ian was highlighting. It's grammar and syntax. And I can check this box, and I can start to look at the types of iffiness or linguistic challenges that actually Ian was talking about. So it would be helpful to provide a barometric pressure display. An emergency light should be built in unless this is too large and heavy. The system must include a rescue beacon, etc. Is involved here. And these checks are actually highly customizable. So we have what we refer to as a best practice from a quality perspective. And that best practice is held within this tool and can be easily modified. So for the purposes of today's webinar, I decided I would create one specifically for this. And you can see on the bottom left, it says Quality Best Practice Webinar Quality Checks February 2010. We shipped a whole bunch of these best practices, and in fact, yes?
It's Adrian. Can you speak just maybe a little bit closer to the microphone and just a little bit slower? The audience was asking if you can speak just a little bit slower so they can follow you.
A little bit slower?
Just just speak just a tad slower so they can follow you.
My apologies. My Irish lineage is getting in the way here. So let me just a little bit try and do as you say, Adrian, and slow down. So in effect, this area, the quality compliance area, is really oriented around the notion of trapping and instantly spotting the defects, the types of defects that Ian was mentioning just now. So grammar and syntax, etc., would, should, and as I mentioned a moment ago when I was speaking a little bit faster, these are customizable. We refer to these as the best practice, the collection of these. And these can be completely customized with no, it's a point-and-click exercise and you do it directly within the tooling. Let's have a look at missing measurements. So what's going on there? So I'm going to check on missing measurements. And once I do that, I see that there's a whole bunch of things showing up here. And you can see that there's color coding. These colors help us decipher the point in the document where the individual issue is occurring. And if I want to focus solely on missing measurements, I can just collapse this top point. And now I can also do another interesting thing. I can start to make a review. So I can say, actually, you know what? I'd like to start a review cycle here. An emergency light should be built in. You know what? Actually, in this context, emergency light is pretty okay. It's not particularly dangerous, so I'm going to whitelist this because basically I'd like to exclude this from the checks to highlight quality issues. However, when we say MFD must be light to carry, that's clearly not that measurable. There's no expression of weight. So to Ian's point, we really have some issues in this particular document. And what VisibleThread is doing is highlighting that very clearly for our edification so that we can actually get to a much better place faster. Now, if you think about real documents, and again, this is a play document, they are quite voluminous. We frequently see 10, 15, 20 documents. You range the documents from high-level vision statements right down to the actual detailed text spec, right across to test planning. There's no restriction on the type of document that VisibleThread can actually have, and this is one of the beauties of this product. What we're doing is we're saying take a raw, non-marked up, not massaged document, stick it into our server, and immediately we'll give you these types of stats. So it's an automation of a highly mundane process that if it's happening today, it doesn't happen so rigorously because most people simply don't have time to do it properly. So I'm going to enter a comment on my review. So still found outstanding issues need to resolve. So really this is an audit trail around the reviewer capability. So in effect, many business analysts play multiple roles. They play a role of project manager to some extent. They may be doing a certain amount of QA activity. They may be performing the role, of course, the classical role of a BA, which is the interface to the business, and also the conduit to the IT and techie side. So this particular area of being able to review and do collaborative reviews and manage, of course, the history around this, because as you do these reviews, you want to see who's been making what changes when. So you see here that I've just done my quality review. Frank Jones is who I'm logged in as. And again, the multi-user aspects of this is very, very useful because if you're working with colleagues and collaborators who may not necessarily be even in the same location as you, then you can very easily have these reviews done. And the beauty is that with the add-in into Microsoft Word, the actual reviews are happening on the current version of the document. There is no more of this sending around attachments via email and everybody trying to figure out which is the right version and all that mess that happens associated with that. So what have I considered? I've considered two areas that Ian was highlighting. I've considered syntax and grammar and missing measurements. And you might be wondering why it says number 4 here. It's because I'm going to switch into a different area of the product, which is the area around discovery. And Ian's third point in terms of what he was suggesting after he considered missing measurements was one-off terms. Now this is where we use some natural language processing in terms of what we do in our servers, and we're looking and analyzing the content of the documents. We're effectively looking for occurrences of nouns within the document. And that's a very interesting thing because immediately I can see that we've got one occurrence of a rescue beacon. And indeed, if I were to select that, I can see the text associated with that. So whilst we were focusing on terms of dangerousness or indeed that would introduce risks such as etc. a moment ago, we're now looking at the nouns, a rescue beacon for skiing. We have lack of clarity on anything else around what a rescue beacon must do. We see an obvious lack or dearth of scenarios around what's going to happen with a rescue beacon. And indeed, as you look through this, you can see that the word display is occurring once. You can see that there's many, many terms as we look at this which are only occurring in one-off situations. And I would certainly expect, based on our own experience, that the frequency of occurrence of these terms, not just in this document, but across all the documents, will start to increase, and will also start to tighten up and wrap our more scenario-orientated requirements and statements into our document. So you begin to see where the danger is here. The other classic situation in one-off statements, and particularly around nouns, is where you get multiple meanings of effectively two different terms with the same intent. The classic example of that is customer and client, where there is a different author perhaps writing in terms of customer, slightly subtly different business rules around that, whereas somebody else interprets it as client, and you hand that client-oriented document to an offshore entity to do some testing, and then that gets you into trouble because basically there may be subtly different interpretations around what is in client versus customer. So that frequency aspect is really, really important as you actually start to look at that. I'm going to switch back to my quality area because I'd like to look at conflicts. So now what were we talking about in terms of conflicts? Well, I just kind of stuck in a couple here into my reference model, may and unless. And you can see here that as we go through, we see unless this is too large and heavy, as it may be difficult to find batteries. So again, to Ian's point, these things are in effect suggestive of get-out-of-jail clauses. So they're too loose, we can back out of them too easily, they're not rigorous enough, and certainly that may be somewhat appropriate at the very early stages of the document, but if you're into signing off on these things, if they form the quote-unquote contract of engagement, certainly that's not going to fly at that point. In a more agile situation, equally this applies, because even though you may be cutting your deliverables into 6-week deliverables or 4 to 6-week deliverables, there will be something documented on that, and certainly from the business's perspective, there will typically be something documented around that agile project. So in effect, there's no conceptual difference between the agile approach and indeed the waterfall approach from that perspective. Again, these are opinions as opposed to hard and fast facts. So at this point, we've looked at conflicts, and the last area that Ian was talking about was the CRUD test. I've always been a big believer in CRUDing things and being able to create, read, update, delete things. Because typically if you look at these nouns, a rescue beacon, a display, you need to understand where the display gets its actual content. So it is absolutely unclear here in this document as to where that display, where the barometric pressure is actually coming from. You know, you see this one occurrence up here, a barometric pressure display, and it is absolutely unclear as to where that data is coming from, which I just said. And also, perhaps there needs to be some kind of admin module that configures that display. And perhaps there's a kind of a little warning signal that would be required if you're below a certain temperature. Certainly that is the case in most automobiles, where if you're below 2 degrees Celsius or 32 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll put a little red area or something indicating ice on the road and so forth. So these are actually certainly real situations that if you look at real examples of documents, you will find that actually this rather play sandbox or play document is representative of actually more serious issues in larger documents. Just for the fun of it, I'd like to kind of compare and contrast the before and after situation. So we've just gone through the 5 various techniques that Ian was talking about. I hope you begin to see that it's possible to actually automate all of this. And again, we would like to suggest that VisibleThread is the vehicle by which you can do that. I'm going to go back and look at the quality area from a top-line perspective. You'll see that I've got my 3 different documents. You'll see that I can actually expand these, begin to see the number of issues. And you can see the number of issues in the after inspection version of the document is actually 0. So very quickly we can realize that actually the quality aspects, so I took what Ian suggested as being a tidied up version of the document, and we got to a point where there was 0 issues in that document. In real life, what actually happens is that you take the current document, you go to your Word area, you make changes directly within that document, you make a save on the right-hand side, and that gets streamed immediately back to the server, which is very nice because it means that actually in real time, both from a review perspective and also from an authoring perspective, everybody is on the same page in that regard. I just want to finish off by showing you one final example, which is a real-life example. This document has been cleansed to protect the identity of the owner of it, but it's a real example. I'm using a slightly different quality practice. You'll see in a moment the one I'm using. So whilst we were focused more on aspects of missing measurements and one-off terms and syntax and grammar, in this case, in this context, I'm looking at things like optionality. So if I expand that, in the context of this document, the word may and could is occurring quite frequently. And in fact, if I look at that, I can see in the bottom portion, and these are real documents, a ledger fields role may be created that allows access to tasks managing the following sensitive fields. Completely unclear as to exactly when that's going to be. So that's very, very dangerous in terms of this document. Finance role could access or modify any of the above. Under what conditions, in what scenarios can that happen? And may or may not have knowledge of payroll. A lot of very loose statements going on here. The implementation configurations may also be less complex. Indeed, the question is, what does complex mean in this situation? So you can begin to see and appreciate that in a real document, and this document is roughly 25 pages, the challenge can often be, where exactly in that document are you occurring? And just in passing, I'll just kind of finally highlight, I can see graphically on the right-hand side where approximately these issues are occurring. And if I were to go to the exact document, I would have all of this available to me here as well, and I can start to navigate in the document itself. So from an authoring perspective, I'm in a great position to actually modify that and make the changes and bring them back to the server. Altogether, making what was heretofore a very tedious, oftentimes non-occurring process, a much more simple, automated approach, so you can get on with the real work. At this point, I'm going to switch back to my slide deck. And let me just summarize what we've just talked about. So what we're doing in VisibleThread is we're taking raw MS Word documents. We're not nominating markup. We're using natural language processing and high-level pattern matching to give much better quality around the metrics. And we're giving effectively change across all documents. We're also covering out an area that I haven't touched on, which is structural checks to see do you have the right capabilities or the right types of requirements in your documents. So for instance, the classic killers is the uptime, performance, security, and so forth. And we're looking at the analysis of the entities, the noun frequency across documents, looking at both the most frequent occurrences as well as the least frequent. And that, in context of the actual text, allows you very quickly make an assessment as to how much risk is in these documents. Benefits, scope creep. One of the biggest and most difficult things is to avoid scope creep. And there's often a very indirect connection between what happens in the upfront stages and what actually finally transpires, 3 to 6 to 8 months later. So we're trying to avoid this. We're trying to avoid a loss in translation. We're trying to get people on the same page. Everybody can see these documents, and everybody can look at it in a much more real, live fashion, avoiding different interpretations. And the costs. And I mentioned this at the outset. 150K out of 500K is a serious waste of spend. We're trying to avoid a good chunk of that. We're not saying we solve everything, but we will try and certainly give an ROI that is more than justified in terms of what we're talking about today. It's in everybody's interest to make this much better. Program managers, business analysts, technical development needs to get on board, and ultimately, of course, executives, because the cost savings that we're looking at here are real, and they're hard to nail. They're hard ordinarily without some element of automation in terms of this. At this point, I'll just mention that we've got some resources out there, and would like to hand it back to Adrian. I guess, Adrian, we're going to kick into a Q&A session right now, and maybe we can take some questions.
Yeah, thank you, Fergal. Yeah, the number of questions, the number of questions that were submitted. I'm sure you can take a look there and pick some, Fergal, right?
Yeah, sure. Let me just see if I can see the questions. I am going to.
The first question that came up, one of the first questions that came up was, is VisibleThread just a hosted solution, or is there a desktop installed solution as well?
Sure, great. Yeah, let me just quickly address that. So we deploy VisibleThread both in the cloud as a subscription-based service. We also deploy it within the actual context of firewalls. It's deployed as a virtual client in that regard. So it has flexibility to deploy in all facets. So I'm just having a quick review of the questions. Just a couple of things. So here's a question from Salman Salim. I hope I've got your name right, Salman. It's directed really to, I think, you, Ian. How do stakeholders validate requirements if they're unclear on what they need? How do we ensure we've performed validation correctly?
Is that for me?
Sorry, Ian, yes. Let me just repeat the question. I think I've lost. Basically, how do stakeholders validate the requirements if they're unclear on what they need, and how do we ensure we perform validation correctly? I guess it's a pretty profound question.
Yeah, the challenges for different stakeholders are, I think, very great, because stakeholders come from an enormous range of different backgrounds. Some people are very technical. People may be business analysts. People may be managers who used to be developers themselves. They may be very comfortable with the technical aspects of requirements. or they may be very simple, non-technical people, but who need a clear result. They need some software which improves the accounting or shows them their sales figures or, well, does anything. So people may be unclear on how to help in the requirement process. And I think quite an interesting part of requirements engineering is this boundary between people who are in the real world and people who are in the world of development and computers, between things being very informal but felt very much as urgent business needs and things being formalized and understood and structured in computers. And being a good customer is, I think, quite a lot about doing requirements well, writing requirements well. I'm not sure there's any magic bullet here, but identifying goals, noticing when goals are pulling in opposite directions, telling stories, being very willing to be very simple about things. I think people who know me know that I always go on about getting things down to a simple level, getting to the essence of the requirement. When I was a young chap, I tried terribly hard to be a very clever analyst and consultant, and now that there's some grey in my beard, I'm really very happy if I manage to find a simple explanation, if I manage to tell a story or get a workshop to step through a scenario which is really very simple, where everybody agrees and people can see that if that's what we do, that will buy us something. That if the product does that and helps us to work like that, and we do 1, 2, 3 steps, and then the green light comes on, and then we know everything's fine, that's a good result. So maybe the key bit of the answer to this question is very simple. It's that you don't have to try to prove to the techies that you're as techie as they are. The art of being a good stakeholder, in a way, is not to be ashamed to put across the point of view that you have, your view of the world. Well, I'm just out here managing these people on the shop floor, and I need to have a simple summary of who's off sick and who's on overtime and who's on holiday, so that I can see who I'm going to have, in the door at 9 o'clock. And just to be able to be not shy of putting things across very, very simply and straightforwardly. I hope that answers part of the question anyway.
Great. Thanks for that, Ian. Here's another interesting question that I might have a crack at myself, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Ian. Is a CRUD check just used for data? I really am anxious to answer this, just simply because actually it isn't particularly a data question. Well, when you're looking at CRUD, let's assume you're building a system which is a user interface oriented system. The CRUD nouns, the entities, I mean, every entity in a system ultimately will need some level of CRUDness. If you're dealing with a real-time trading system, a trade, a dealer, an authorization, a ticket, these are all CRUDable entities. So are they data? I guess they are data in a sense, and nouns of any serious value typically need to be CRUDed in some fashion. So in that context, we need a screen for displaying this. We probably need a log file which has a action on each of these CRUDable entities with an appropriate level of detail and timestamps and so forth. We also need probably in an object-oriented system an object that represents each of these data items. We need, in one sense, a back-end, a database component, a database table, referential integrity, and so forth, connecting these. So I suppose I'm just doing a little bit of a thought process. Any noun of significance from the perspective, at least in my view, is going to need some element of associated credibility applied to it. So David, in terms of that question, hope that answers it, but at least that's my view. I'd be curious in your thoughts.
I think I agree with this. I mean, basically, CRUD is a traditional data processing concept. Obviously, when we're moving over to an object-oriented way of doing things, then the boundary between program and data is blurred. An object contains its own data, and you can create object instances and so on. But fundamentally, it's about creating and reading and updating and destroying data items. Fundamentally, yes.
Okay, here's another one. Actually, this is more oriented for me. So Andres Ariza, if I got that right, from Spain, it looks like, or from Mexico possibly, asks, do we have a Spanish version of the product? And the answer is no, not currently. But certainly we would anticipate in time we will look to internationalize and have international aspects of it. We do, however, so when you look at internationalization from a product perspective, you look at two levels. One is the aspect of can you take international data and cross-reference it with international sets of data, and the answer to that is yes. However, the other aspect is localization. Do you have a localized version in Spanish? And the answer to that is no. So today, we can certainly process Spanish language, or indeed any language that is based off a non-Eastern orientation, French, Spanish, German, but it is not localized at this point. Let me go to the next one. Agile lean approaches. So here's a question of what kind of differences do you find in terms of agile approaches? Can you maybe speak to that a little bit?
A little probably. I think fundamentally when you're trying to discover what something is supposed to do, you're always looking at things in the beginning functionally. You're always asking, what is it that it's got to do? What are the tasks we've got to accomplish with this software or whatever it is? If people are doing the extreme programming or other agile methods, then fundamentally people are writing things like user stories. Traditionally, they were literally on index cards. Now, of course, there are lots of software equivalents of that. But fundamentally, what people are doing is writing down functions, writing a little bit of detail down around them, some bit of the story which goes with the requirement, and they're thinking about it as something that they can develop as a lump, as a unit. And when people are doing object-oriented development and they're collecting use cases, again, they're thinking about lumps of stuff, lumps of functionality that they can develop. And that is a difference in attitude from the traditional write your requirements down up front, analyze that, make a design, trade off different designs, and then divide it into pieces, issue each piece to a subcontractor, get all the pieces built, integrate them. So that is a different way of going about things. And I think there's no doubt that it's very nice to do things in a rapid prototyping, agile, rapid development. There are lots and lots of words for this kind of thing. It's very nice if you can, if you've got the kind of problem which is amenable to this, it's really nice to do your requirement work fairly quickly, have that cycle of discovering and documenting, do the validation by actually building and testing some code, show it to people, see if they like it, see what else they want, discover some more requirements. It fits very well. The only thing is not every kind of product or service can be done like that.
Great. Thanks so much, Ian. Just a couple more questions then, and we'll wrap up the webinar. Question from Theodora Tonkowska is, when you discover non-compliant words with the tool, can you update them directly in the document? And the answer, Theodora, is absolutely yes. And that is in real time, floated back to the dashboard so you get those updates and change history accordingly. Let me just go through a couple of other things. This is a little bit of a repetition on what you just talked about. Can the VisibleThread gentleman, just give me a sec here, lost my place. Apologies. Can the VisibleThread gentleman explain how the tool could work in an agile scenario? And that's from Donna Reed, I believe. So in that context, what we're doing in VisibleThread, and if you look at feature cards, story cards, which is what Donna is asking about, effectively what we're seeing is that when you actually articulate the story cards, when you actually put them on a cue card, clearly if the content never gets into a document, there's very little that we can do at that point. But what we find in certain Agile shops is that you set up a structure whereby you've got a project feature set, and it's along the lines of feature-driven development. And that feature set effectively has a doc per card, or indeed a doc incorporating a number of features or feature card contents. So the exact same approach works in that context, where you're actually scanning the content of the documents for loose and slightly ambiguous vague terms according to the appropriate level of checks that are actually contained within the relevant quality checks. So it's applicable in that regard, and certainly at this point we have a number of folks who are using VisibleThread in pilots around Agile approaches, and we find it's quite applicable in that context. One thing I'd like to mention, I do apologize for this, I know that there's been a lot of complaints on the questions or comments around the my softness of voice. I apologize for that. It's one of those things that I'm working on. And secondly, the sound quality doesn't appear to have been fantastic, so my apologies on that. Here's a question from Sven Beckerlands. Can I customize the search criteria into my own language? So it's a variation on that linguistic or kind of localization question. And again, the search criteria themselves can be reflected in a local language. The localization of the software products itself is currently not there. Second question, does it check all the IEEE requirements characteristics? From Stanley Zuniga. Stanley, in that context, certainly we would frequently have reference models, which would be, for instance, the ISO 9126 specification for security requirements, where you expect certain structural things to be in place within a document, and we can cross-reference that with documents. So really, if you'd like to find out more on that, I'd recommend that get in contact with us, and maybe we can set up a demonstration around that. At this point, I just want to say that we've come to the end of the webinar. Appreciate everybody's participation. Apologies again on the sound quality. And hopefully you've got some value from the presentation that Ian has done. I certainly enjoyed it thoroughly. And hopefully you can see some value in terms of automating these types of techniques using VisibleThread. And if you would like to follow up with us, I'd be more than happy to take any emails from anybody in the audience. Adrian, can I hand back to you at this point?
Yep. Thank you, Fergal, and thank you, everyone, for attending this Modern Analyst webinar. And many thanks to Ian and Fergal for a very informative presentation. And, of course, many thanks to VisibleThread, who sponsored this event. I wanted to point out again that the webinar, along with the slides, will be archived within a couple days of the event at both at ModernAnalyst.com and at VisibleThread.com. As also at VisibleThread.com, you can access the 21-day free trial of their product if you want to play with it and learn more. Thank you again, everyone, for attending this webinar. This concludes today's event. We hope you have a great day.